Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, and I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. When I first started this podcast back in 2023, I had no plans to try and make money from it at all. And I'm very conscious that that remains the case. I'm still not aiming to make money, but I am also of the view that some of you feel that actually I'm adding a lot of value to what you do, and therefore I have set up, and it's been there for some time now, a Patreon site that allows people to make a financial contribution to the podcast if they wish to, because if you're getting genuine value from it, then please perhaps take the opportunity to provide me back some of that value and make a contribution. If you go to www.patreon.com or the support the show link in your podcast platform, you'll find the opportunity to join as either a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. And for a very small amount of money, less than the cost of a cup of coffee from the majority of major high street brands, then actually you'll be able to make a real difference to what I do with the podcast, and I would be enormously grateful. But for now, I'm just really, really grateful to have you here joining me. So sit back, if that's what you're doing, and enjoy the show. Thanks very much. I've been meaning to talk about resilience in a little more detail for a while. I covered personal resilience and self-care back in episode 8, way back in September 2023. Amazing that I've been doing this for nearly 2 years now, and this is episode 99. And the topic of resilience feels much bigger and more relevant now, certainly to me in some ways. So I thought I'd touch on it again now as a thematic episode before we get to episode 100 next week, when I'll definitely have a guest episode to give to you for that special number. I don't want to get too political, and I never want to get too political in these podcasts. I try very hard to avoid getting drawn into too much political debate, although there's obviously a lot of that around. But it's impossible to ignore my own experience and my training from almost 3.5 decades of military service when I look at the geopolitical arena that we all are now inhabiting. And I have a view that I probably shared by many people, I suspect, that the world is becoming, has already become in many ways, a very dangerous place. Old alliances, the rules we have lived by, all the things that we seem to totally take for granted have just become a lot less reliable and a bit more of a concern that actually they're not so assured in terms of what we're going to get from them. And I think that's really apparent in what's happening with recent political rhetoric, not least from the United States, but that's not the only nation that's involved in this. And is consequently causing quite a lot of concern, quite rightly, with lots of people, particularly in big alliances. The big alliances have, without any shadow of a doubt, I think, kept the peace since the end of the Second World War. And that's a really, really important thing, which we should not lose sight of. And we've also become quite comfortable, quite complacent about the way of life we have and the way we live that life. And that, I think, is tricky in a world where things are less certain and things are less sure that it's going to continue that way. In the UK, we've just had, very recently announced, a strategic defence review launched by our new government. Not so new now, been there nearly a year, and that's taken a while to come out, not least, I think, because the goalposts for them were constantly moving with everything that was going on around the world. And that's made it doubly difficult to come up with a kind of policy and a framework for what that defence review needs to look like. There's going to be a national security strategy that comes out very shortly as well, which will add another layer on top of that. And in many ways, that's equally important, if not more important, in terms of setting the overall framework for the UK's national security. And a lot of other nations will be doing some very similar things. And there's a very lively debate about the amount of government defence expenditure that you should allow to be spent on defence and national security against, obviously, a series of political choices around all sorts of other things, including health, welfare, education, etc., to name but a few. And that has been the debate for a very long time now. And the age-old story that there's no votes in defence, I think, has been largely true, certainly in the UK, for a very long time, that it is just not something that people were particularly focused on. And that's a challenge, because inevitably it's becoming more obvious that we need to be focused on it for all sorts of obvious reasons. The debate right now is about, should we up our defense expenditure in the UK? By how much? What's the government saying? The government has said its trajectory is towards 3%. Actually, there's going to be a NATO summit very shortly that's going to turn around and talk probably about 5.5%. And the UK risks, having been at the forefront of defense expenditure, certainly outside the United States, risk suddenly becoming actually the poor man in terms of what we're contributing. And that's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult around those political tables for senior leaders of all persuasions to actually manage that. The other interesting thing is when you look at what you get for 3 to 5% versus what you actually would have to spend if you end up in some kind of full-scale conflict. And I was at a presentation very recently by General Sir Richard Barrons, and I'll talk more about him in a minute, about exactly this. Are we ready for war in the 21st century? Stark as a title, very challenging in terms of some of the debate that he put on the table. And the short answer is no, we're not. We're clearly not. We're not in a great place at all. And if you actually do face a full-scale war, the likelihood is that you'll be spending somewhere between 35 and 55% of your GDP on what you're actually doing to fight that war. And that's without talking about the consequences of the war itself, all the dramatic damage and infrastructure ruin that comes from it, not to mention, obviously, the very significant loss of life and upset for millions and millions of people. You only have to look at Ukraine to get a really stark example of what that kind of total war scenario feels like for them as a population. It wasn't that long ago that Kyiv, for example, was a very normal city with a thriving economy and everything felt very, very normal to the population there. And if you look at them now, you'll see a very, very different picture indeed. But these are political spending choices, without a shadow of a doubt. And post the Cold War, the peace dividend ensued. Everyone was very comfortable that actually we now won the Cold War, if you like. The Soviet Union had collapsed on itself, and we're now in a position that actually we could afford to spend a great deal less on defense, cut back a lot on our defense resources. And the UK was one of many countries that did exactly that. And the Air Force I left in 2015 was about 31,000 people versus the one I joined in 1980 when the Cold War was certainly still in full swing. And at that stage, the Air Force was 98,000. So it was 2/3 reduction really from when I joined to when I left. And with a lot of capability enhancements in terms of equipment, without a doubt, but quantity matters. Quantity really matters in terms of overall capability. And when you look at defense in the round now for the UK, there's no question that what we've done is we've moved from a position where we actually had a relatively balanced set of defense capabilities, from conventional at the one end with quite an extensive set and both in terms of the variety of different things and also quantity of things, through to ultimately a nuclear deterrent at the very far end and a full-up nuclear capability. We've allowed that conventional element to be atrophied very, very substantially. And we still have the defense, we still have the nuclear deterrent, of course, at the very high end. But the difference between conventional warfare and nuclear warfare is, of course, literally apocalyptic. And no one wants to get to that nuclear war position at all. So if you're going to use it as a deterrent, it has to mean something. You don't want to be in a position where ultimately you're very quickly going to be into that's all we've got left. And actually the risk is that actually we could be in that kind of position. When you look at the peace dividend that we've had, the atrophying of defense capability, the emphasis, which still remains certainly in the UK, on a lot of other things that are deemed to be much, much more important by the electorate and therefore by the politicians, because at the end of the day, they want to get elected and they want to get re-elected. So they're going to focus on those kind of areas. And it's meant that stockpiles have been reduced in terms of actual ammunition and missiles and the raw material you need if you're going to actually fight military capability or use military capability in a fighting sense. But also the platforms themselves have been reduced, partly because we've just got less and we've just wanted to buy less, but also because they've become so expensive that you can't afford as many anyway. And that generates its own set of challenges. And I'm not convinced, if I'm honest, that the Strategic Defence Review, as it's currently framed, that we've just launched is really going to answer some of the searching questions that we need it to. It's been put together by some very, very capable and clever people, much cleverer than me, who've, I think, written a great document and put together a great piece of work. But it's going to depend heavily on those political choices made by the government. Are they actually prepared to turn around and really put real muscle and real money into what needs to be done in terms of changing the capability? Because if we don't get that conventional capability back to a better place, then it starts to become very, very challenging very quickly, I think. And related to that is our kind of wider alliances and what's going on with NATO, what's going on with the European Union, etc. The UK left the European Union. That was a choice I didn't personally support, but at the same time, the country voted for it, and therefore we have made that choice, and we now have to live and abide by it, obviously. But in military alliance terms, NATO, I think, has never been under more stress than it is now. Partly a good thing by America turning around under Donald Trump and saying, right, we need to step up and pay more, and we need to pay more for our own defense. And I think it's absolutely a fair comment that actually we have not been doing that. We've allowed ourselves to be far too reliant on a US defense umbrella for far too long and expected them to essentially foot the bill. And that's completely unreasonable. So I think that's an entirely appropriate pressure point. The bigger worry is that in the same breath, it's will they actually support even in the moment when we're turning around and saying, well, we need to step up our own capabilities. If something happened now, what will we do? And it's going to take us years, decades potentially to turn around and get ourselves back into a defensive position that we need to really be in to face off against what look to be some of the emergent significant threats, and not least a resurgent Russia, which is undoubtedly wounded and bruised as a result of what's gone in Ukraine, but also then sees lots of other actors outside Ukraine, not least in the NATO context, as enabling Ukraine and therefore being part of the problem of why they've failed to achieve their own objectives and so on. So that makes Russia dangerous for all of us. And we need to be aware of that. We need to also be aware of the gray areas around this. You don't need that much hard power if you're turning around and saying, well, you can turn the lights off in a country by taking down the electricity grid. If you can turn off the banking system by basically cyber hacking the banks and enabling or not enabling people to turn around and get their money out. And if you disrupt the supply chain, which is so critical to everything that runs. The most obvious example is immediately food. And our supermarkets clearly are totally reliant on that. They know they have a day-to-day supply chain that is very much just in time in terms of putting food on the shelves. So if you mess around with that, then you see the chaos that ensues very, very quickly. Witness Marks and Spencer in the UK recently, cyber attack that has really not only cost them a huge amount of money, but massive disruption to their own ability to actually service customer demand. Now, that's fine if it's done in isolation. It's not fine for Marks and Spencer, but it's fine as a general populace thing. But it's certainly not fine if it's done to everybody at the same time. So if suddenly your whole supply chain gets disrupted, or your whole electricity grid gets disrupted, or your banking system gets completely disrupted, you lose the ability to work your mobile phone. You have internet disruption that's really significant that you can't actually communicate, because most people these days are working on voice over internet protocol telephones, etc. So suddenly those things, again, that we had that were relatively resilient capabilities in the past are now quite exposed. No question about it. And if you don't believe me, one of the things I would recommend, I don't often recommend other podcasts, but this one is most definitely worth a listen. Sky News have produced a war game scenario called The War Game. And it's a series of episodes. They're about an hour long. You can get them off all the normal podcast platforms. And if you look up The War Game, you will find it very easily. And I absolutely recommend you listen to it, because it is compelling in a relatively awful and rather scary way. And I won't shy away from saying that, in terms of looking at just how isolated the UK is, certainly in terms of its own capability in the absence of allied support. And how would we face some really difficult decisions when the chips are down and you're given a threat that got to suddenly deal with and honor and work against, in a world where false flag operations are very common and cyber attacks are very common, and the attribution of those kind of things is very difficult to manage. So the war game is great. It's great not least because what's been done is it's been put together with a series of players in the game who have immense credibility. I mentioned General Sir Richard Barron's earlier. A good friend of mine has done a podcast for me. And my boss in my last two jobs, a really, really experienced senior commander, 4-star level commander, he plays the Chief of the Defence Staff. Ben Wallace, former Secretary of State for Defence in the UK, former Security Minister in the UK, plays the Prime Minister. We've got former Labour politicians, Jack Straw, who was a former Foreign Secretary, playing the Foreign Secretary. We've got Amber Rudd playing the Home Secretary, who was a Home Secretary in the previous government. There's people like Lord Mark Sedwell playing the National Security Advisor. He was the National Security Advisor. So these are not actors who are acting out some ridiculous scenario. They are working through a set of problems they're presented and looking at those in a very, very realistic way without it obviously delving into the realm of highly classified information, etc. So I mention it because, again, I'm talking here about a lot of stuff that people might go, well, yeah, whatever. But I really do think the time is right for us to start thinking about, in the UK, but also wider outside the UK, a really strong debate about national security, national resilience, and personal resilience. Because both of those things, individual resilience and societal resilience, have taken an absolute nosedive in the past few years. I've mentioned it already, but mobile phones, certainty of supply, speed of delivery. Everyone orders on Amazon and expects stuff to be delivered the very next day, if not the same day. The global village, we don't care where it comes from. We just care that it arrives. Our own national independence and national supply chain security and our protection of our critical national infrastructure, as well as our actual defense capability in the round, are really, really challenged. We're individually also much less tolerant of things like power cuts, loss of mobile phone signal, loss of internet, supply chain disruption. All of those things, we used to be really tolerant about that sort of stuff, not least because we didn't have some of them. When I grew up in the 70s, we didn't have the internet, obviously. We didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have any of this kind of just-in-time supply stuff. And we just basically got on with it. I can remember, as I was a kid at home, my mum very regularly had power cuts and things, and you just basically lived through it. You just sorted it out and got on with it. And we can still do that, but it's not anywhere near as easily tolerable and as comfortable as it used to be. And we're definitely not feeling that kind of existential threat moment that is out there. Potentially, our way of life could be massively, massively disrupted. And we need to start feeling that a little bit more. Part of that is a challenge for politicians, again, because they don't want to scare the population. They don't want to turn around and create some sort of panic. But the reality is, if you look at things that are going on elsewhere and the potential immediacy with which those kind of threats could come to our door, then this is a really, really big problem. One very obvious and fairly well-trailed example is ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles obviously can be conventional. They can also be nuclear. And they fly very fast and very high, and they are extremely difficult to defeat. The UK has effectively no defense against ballistic missile attack. And you also don't know when it's incoming, and you can't know when it's incoming, apart from whether you've got intelligence maybe at the source, whether it's a nuclear warhead on the missile or whether it's a conventional one. You only know that when it actually lands and explodes. So those kind of threats, which can be launched from very significant distances away, intercontinental distances away, can be on our doorstep with almost an immediate impact. And we need to be at least aware of what our vulnerabilities are and thinking about, are we prepared to just accept those? Are we prepared to just roll forward and do what we do and continue pumping huge quantities of money into welfare, huge quantities of money into health, which are both really important things. I'm not belittling them at all, but not actually having necessarily the security that protects our way of life. Every government, since I've been listening to anything to do with politics, the Prime Minister of the day will always say the national security of the country is the top priority. And I don't think any leader of any country is going to say anything different. But the reality is there's a difference between the rhetoric and the reality. You have to make sure you're putting your money where your mouth is and you are genuinely doing something about national security if you want that to really mean something and be a relevant statement. And I'm not sure we're in that space. I'm really not sure we're in that space at the minute. And I brought this up today because I'm just very conscious. I've been listening to the War Game podcast. I've been looking at what's been going on the TV, in not least with what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and has been there for a long time. What's also going on with Israel and Gaza, what's now going on with Israel and Iran, the potential for America to start playing in that space, the potential now for Iran to start looking at some retaliatory attacks on those who are seen by them as enabling, helping, supporting, etc. And all of that starts to bring threats that we need to be cognizant of. We need to be thinking about. It's not necessarily just as straightforward as it used to be. Our way of life is very much not in our control in the way that it used to be. We have been far too willing, in my view, to sell off national infrastructure, whether that's the power grid, whether that's the phone system, whether it's the supply chains that turn around and make sure that we're actually got stuff on our shelves, our reliance on overseas supply, particularly for food, but also for a myriad of other things, is absolutely a big risk for us. And we need to be at least, I suppose, taking a big boy set of decisions on this. And I think the government sits there and it considers some of this stuff, and it has a national risk register and those sorts of things, and looks at the way these things work. But I don't think the population at large has been thinking about it very hard at all. And that's why I wanted to talk about it a little bit today, because I do think we need to start thinking a little bit about what life might be like if all the things we take for granted are suddenly not there anymore. If suddenly you absolutely can't just buy what you want when you want it and have it delivered to you in the next day or the day after. If suddenly you go to the supermarket and the shelves are pretty much empty. Look back to COVID not very long ago, where shelves were stripped bare by people panic buying, needlessly panic buying, because they don't have that wider societal view that actually, do you know what? I'll take what I need, but I don't need more than that. So therefore I'll leave stuff for other people. And that's, again, all part of this major problem that is definitely in society as a whole, I think. It's not just geopolitics. Climate change is in this space too. I think climate change is going to change the shape of our future world. There's no question about it. And by extension, that will influence the geopolitics, because it's going to be, as the world warms and you'll see, significant chunks of it becoming less and less habitable. You'll see challenges around water availability or scarcity of water, and that's going to generate conflict for sure. It's going to generate migration flows. Very, very hot topic in the UK, obviously, migration or immigration, and particularly economic migration, illegal economic migration. We probably have only scratched the very surface of that if we get into a serious climate change space here. So I guess I'm saying we need to individually start thinking about this. So what are you thinking about in your life about your personal resilience? How much are you preparing yourself and your own awareness and education for what is going on in the world? And what are you doing with that information? It may well be you're completely happy and you're comfortable and that's absolutely fine, and you're relying on the government to sort it out and you're very happy with that. That's fine. If you are, then I'm not really going to try anything that's going to push you into a different space. But I would encourage you to at least do a check-in with yourself on that. Are you actually really aware of what's going on? In today's world, one of the dangers is that you get fed everything by social media, and you get social media based on what you've watched and what you've read and all the rest of it. So you're being fed a diet of things that actually is consistent with what you've already listened to and heard and seen. So it's reinforcing your views. Now, that might be a good thing, but it may also be a very bad thing. So think about broadening your appetite for what you actually read, what you watch, what you listen to. Try and make sure you are getting the broadest based set of knowledge. Pay attention to those who actually know a thing or two about this stuff. And when they're making an argument that actually we need to be thinking a little bit harder about what we're going to do in terms of national resilience, then that's something you should be supporting. In that kind of political debate, start challenging your MP. What are you doing about this? What's your view? What's your stance on this? It doesn't matter what color of party it is. That's irrelevant now. This is firmly about making sure that for the future we have a better, more resilient society that is able to withstand some of these seismic shocks that potentially are coming down the road to meet us. Individually, I'm not suggesting you start having a bunker in the back garden. I'm not quite going that far. But I think you want to think about your own lifestyle and how responsive are you and capable are you of operating without some of the things you take completely for granted today. I joke very often that map reading is a thing of the past. People totally reliant seemingly these days on mobile phones and the GPS enablement that they bring, which are great. And I use it all the time myself. But I can still pick a map up and a compass up and I can navigate myself around. And I really think that kind of skill is important. Basic techniques to go and make sure you can cook, you can survive, you can do stuff that is going to make sure you can work without electricity for a while. And you're having those kind of provisions. I would think it's a sensible thing that you should be thinking about doing that. Now, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who listen to this podcast, and probably it might be the last one of my podcast you listen to. I hope not, with episode 100 just around the corner. But I just think that it's one of those debates that I certainly find myself listening to some of the rhetoric, some of the conversation and the political discourse in particular, and getting increasingly frustrated that we're just not grasping the nettle. And I just wanted to highlight some of those things today because I think it's something that everybody should be starting to think about, because it's just so important to turn around and make sure that we, for the long term, for the sake of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., that we are actually doing the very best we can to keep the peace that we have kept since 1945, by and large, in Western Europe and the wider world, absolutely as it is now. And it's obviously challenged right now. And some of that definitely bears some thinking about. I'm sorry if this is a bit alarmist. I don't mean it to be. And, I'm definitely aware that could be sort of waving a flag a little bit that's not necessarily going to be helpful for some people. But I do think stimulating that national debate on enhanced national security and national resilience is a really, really important thing to do. So if I whet your appetite to think about that, then I've done my job today, and I'm very happy. And I absolutely recommend that if you can get at it, you listen to The War Game as a podcast, because I think that will give you some perspectives that you may not have known about and you may not have thought about previously, and that again might reinforce some of the thinking about this, because it's a powerful, powerful program that is airing some stuff that I think really does need to be said. That's it for this week. As I say, episode 99 seemed like a good time to do this. Episode 100 coming up very shortly. I can't quite believe I've got to episode 100, but I'm delighted I have. And if you're still listening to me at this stage, and then I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you very much indeed. See you soon. All the very best. Bye now.